Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So let's continue our lectures within the series of lecture I am delivering concerning human rights and media tracking. So today we are going to tackle human rights in writing and reporting. So I think that now you do have many ideas about the interplay between human rights and the government organization, and at the same time, the interplay between media, human rights and media advocacy. We tackled also so many issues. Okay, so I hope that you are not fed up with this question of human rights. Today we're going to see some standard ethical standards, for example, that concern human rights, especially in writing and reporting, and what are the elements, the premises that we should, principles, standards that we should take into consideration while reporting on human rights. I know that we have seen this formally speaking via development journalism, via media advocacy, via the role of non-government organizations, for example. But today, so we will talk about just if you are in the process, remember the will plan that we talked about yesterday. Now, if you have finished that process of writing, reporting on human rights, so what is the thing, for example, that you should take into consideration, like the thing that we did mention before, self-evaluation. So, therefore, this lecture intends to reach these objectives and goals. So, like the number one is to explore ethical standards in human rights reporting, to analyze real-world examples of reporting on human rights issues and their impact, to examine the challenges journalists face when covering human rights topics, and to discuss some strategies for sensitive, accurate, and impactful human rights storytelling. So this is something very important in human rights because it helps, of course, human rights being published, being known, and being, of course, disseminated, being spread. And this is the role of reporting and writing. So we have already talked about the role of development journalism in, of course, legitimizing, in disseminating human rights issues, human rights abuses, also women's rights abuses, and so on and so forth. Now, today, so we are going to see these objectives, and we are going to make allusion to United Nations Development Program. So, according to the United Nations, reporting is an essential element of the human rights monitoring cycle and a fundamental part of the field's presence human rights work and strategy. So, human rights reports constitute a primary tool to record and analyze information, present findings of monitoring and fact-finding activities, express concern about human rights, a human rights problem, engage in dialogue and advocate with authorities, and propose recommendations for corrective action. So this is grosso modo the general elements that a report, for example, on human rights, or a writing, or a story on human rights that should take into consideration. So it is this report is very essential to human rights. Why? Because without reporting, so we cannot know about human rights abuses, for example, or even we cannot know about human rights promotion. So this is something very important, and human rights report should constitute a primary tool to record and analyze. So it records, so these are like the strategies. So it records, it analyzes information, sometimes it presents finding, and it deals also with proposing recommendations and solutions. So I think that we talked yesterday, and I was very clear in defining to you that the will plan. So how to come up with a very efficient, a very effective report on human rights, or even on maybe up-to-date issues that your community, for example, is suffering from, or is so this is what how the United States, for example, defines the United Nations defined reporting. So these are some ethical standards that the reporters, for example, should take into consideration and should bear in their mind while reporting. So the first one is accuracy and objectivity. So it does mean that ensuring facts should be correct, and it should provide balanced perspectives to avoid sensationalism. So this is something very important in human rights reports. So they should be very accurate, very precise, very concise, and at the same time very objective and very neutral, and beyond of course any bias, beyond any prejudgment, beyond any prejudice. So this is the first thing that human rights reporting, for example, should take into consideration. Respect for dignity and privacy. So this is also one of the ethical standards in human rights reporting. It means respecting the humanity of individuals, particularly victims and survivors who might be affected by how their stories are portrayed. So we do know that those reporters, for example, those journalists, so they have a very noble mission in reporting, in taking risks, for example, to analyze, to report on issues, on human rights abuses and human rights issues in general. But at the same time, we do know that they face this challenge, and we talked already about this challenge. So they face the challenge of respecting the humanity of the individual. Sometimes even they face this challenge of portraying, depicting, taking pictures of survivors, for example, like war survivors, sometimes even people with disabilities. So it's very hard sometimes to deal with these issues. So they should of course respect that dignity while reporting. They should respect the privacy of people while reporting. Of course, they should have that skill. They should use a very skillful strategy, of course, to report. And this is something that is very familiar to skillful, of course, journalists, especially development journalism. Avoiding harm, also, this is one of the ethical standards. So journalists should minimize potential harm to sources, such as retaliation or stigma, by anonymizing identities when needed. So this is something also very important. So these reports shouldn't harm people and shouldn't, of course, undermine people or underestimate people. So while reporting, so we should, of course, respect the privacy, be very objective, respect dignity. We have talked about, maybe in the first lecture, we highlighted the fact that one of the major things that surrounds, of course, human rights is establishing human dignity. And of course, the role of development journalism, or the role even of reporting on human rights, is to establish that dignity, not to disrespect that dignity. So this is the first thing, is to establish dignity, to promote dignity. So this is something very, very crucial to human rights reporting. Transparency, so this is very needed, being transparent about reporting methods, especially when covering sensitive or controversial topics. So we should be very, very objective, very transparent also, and we should be very sincere in order to build trust. And this is something very important in reporting on human rights. So you should build trust with your community, for example, or with peoples all over the world. So transparency, this is one of the ethical standards in human rights reporting, and it is very demanded. Now we will go to strategies for sensitive reporting. So as I have said, so reporting, it's not an easy task, but it's a crucial task to report on human rights. So this is something very important, but it's not an easy task. So journalists, for example, reporters, so they should adapt many strategies, or be adapted to many strategies, rather many skillful, effective, impactful strategies, in order to, of course, provide their communities and provide people with a truthful information beyond any subjectivity or bias. So building trust with sources. So this is something very important. Establishing trust is essential particularly with individuals in vulnerable situations. So sometimes, because sometimes reporters, so they interview people. So before interviewing people, so they should build that trust, and they should be adapted to those people. They should respect them in the first instance, and they should know how to get information from them without, of course, without touching their human dignity. So this is something very important. So they should take into consideration their vulnerable situation. This often involves spending time listening and letting sources share their stories at their own space or pace. So this is something very important. So they should listen very carefully, and they should interpret what those people, for example, are saying in a very tentative way, because this is something also very very pivotal and very essential. So this is how they can build trust with their sources, be they, for example, because sources, they are very different. Maybe people, they will be sources, maybe students, maybe books also, information, media advocacy platforms, digital media outlets, and so on and so forth. So many, because those reporters, so they get information from different sources. So they should, of course, take this into consideration. Anonymity and confidentiality. So this is also something very important. So journalists must understand the importance of confidentiality agreements and ethical responsibility to protect the identity of sources. This is very crucial, because sometimes, if especially I'm talking here about development journalists, for example, so this is their mission, or media advocacy, for example, journalists. So this is their mission. So they should understand this importance of confidentiality, this importance of ethical responsibility, in order to report on human rights in a very neutral, objective way. Their language, or the language within the report, for example, should be very clear, avoiding technical or legal jargon that makes, of course, reports accessible and are more widely understood. So this is something very important. Sometimes, if the language is not clear, so you cannot transmit your message in a very tangible way. So the language should be very palpable, very clear, a clear-cut language that, of course, makes it very easy to access the people, and to access the viewers or the listeners, for example, or even the members of your community, your spectators. Uh, yes, so this is something very important in the report, in the writing of the report. So the language should be very simple and very clear at the same time. Culturally sensitive language, so using culturally appropriate terms and avoiding stereotypes or biases that could misrepresent the communities involved. This is something very important, especially when someone is reporting on a culture or on a community that he or she doesn't know. Or sometimes, those, for example, reported, they should pay attention to the question of gender. Sometimes they just write their report on he, and they forget about he or she, for example. And the article is rendered very biased or very gender biased. So those biases, so people who take care of this reporting mission, they should pay attention to this question of stereotypical. Maybe they will. This is a challenge indeed, because it's stereotypical, for example, issue, but they should pay attention to it while writing or while handling, of course, their reports. So in order not to misrepresent people, because their job is to represent people in a very adequate way, not to fall in the trap of, again, of misrepresentation or underrepresentation. Okay, because their mission is the opposite, is to represent people adequately in an objective way, in a neutral way, not to misrepresent people or to fall in that trap. Well, so at the same time, if they respect those strategies, for example, there are so many other strategies. Okay, so this is just these are the most important ones that reporters, for example, can use, or that this is what you can find in the writing, human rights writing and reporting. Also, there is something that they should consider is writing for impact, and they should consider the storytelling techniques. Many reporters, for example, and many like development journalists. So when they write about many journalists, indeed, when they write about um, human rights abuses, so sometimes they narrate a story. They talk about like stories that happened maybe a month ago or a week ago or just yesterday. So it's a sort of storytelling, but it's a story that is full of significances, that is full of symbols, and it's almost it's a story that has a meaning. It's very meaningful, and it has a symbolic, like a human right symbolic dimension. So it's not just a story for entertainment, but it has a meaning. It entails in its fold a meaning, and that meaning, of course, in order to be disseminated in a very good way, very skillful way. So those reporters should consider those techniques. So personal narrative using first-hand account from victims or survivors makes issues more relatable and impactful. So this is something very important that they should use in order to impact their society. Because what is the purpose behind even development journalism, behind media advocacy, is to advocate for human rights, to advocate for development, for again for human development, to advocate for progress, for having a prosperous, for example, community, a prosperous country. So they should have an impact, and in order to have that impact, so they should keep that first-hand account, for example, from victims or survivors. And this is also it's very healthy because it confirms again objectivity and neutrality. Contextualizing with data, so combining personal stories with relevant statistics helps emphasize the scale of the issue. So this is also very important. So you contextualize the data. I told you many times that speaking within a context, it does matter in human rights. This is something very important. Why? Because if we contextualizing with the data, so of course we do respect the community specificities, either cultural specificities, sometimes social specificities or particularities, political also particularities. So we should contextualize the issue. We should contextualize with the data. So this is something very important, that in order to reach that impact, in order to have, of course, a tremendous impact on human rights issues and on our communities. Highlighting solutions. So this is also, it alludes us to the will plan. So of course, after narrating, after contextualizing with the data, after analyzing the issue, identifying the issue, and so on and so forth. So you here, it's like you make some recommendations. So you highlight solutions. It means reporting on positive outcomes or efforts toward change, empowers audiences and supports advocacy for policy reform. So this is something very important. When you highlight solutions, when you end your report with positive outcomes, positive consequences. Sometimes it's very hard to have positive outcomes, but anyway, so you try to just end with something which is positive, to just keep your community energetic vibes. Okay, this is something very important in because the intention behind all these reports, for example, is empowerment, is to empower people, for example, to make them very active in their societies, to identify uprising issues, to talk about debatable, controversial issues, for example, that your community is suffering from. So this is the purpose behind those reports, and of course they do matter because we cannot do we cannot do without them. So the impact of human rights reporting. So this is it after you finish, for example, your report, or after you write about human rights abuses or either human rights prosperity. Why not? So this is our aim. It's to reach a prosperous world, okay, full of human rights, and also where we can find, we can enjoy all human rights. So the impact of human rights reporting policy change, this is something very important. Sometimes a report can make a change. A report, for example, can enable communities, for example, to make legal changes, legal to reform legal, for example, laws and so on and so forth. I think that we saw, if you still remember that video about the two aisles with that development journalism, if you still remember how they made a tremendous progress thanks to this media advocacy and thanks to this to development journalism, and that was very very important. So the two aisles of course progressed at the same time. So if you still remember in what we talked about in our previous lectures, so policy changes, so reports on human rights violations can lead to reforms. Why not? To revise the law, sometimes legal revisions such as changes in immigration policy, new law. If you still remember, we talked about how that immigration law can be revised, for example, thanks to development journalism, thanks to many organizations and government organizations, or new laws protecting women's rights, people with disabilities, vulnerable people in general, marginalized people, or people just in inferior situations. International pressure, so detailed reporting can prompt international sanctions on investigations, as seen in the coverage of human rights abuses, okay, in Myanmar. So this is also something which is very important in concerning the impact of human rights. So in addition to policy change, legal reforms, legal revisions, changes in policies, so this is also can prompt international sanctions, and we did of course see many examples of this international pressure. Policy awareness also and advocacy, by informing the public, human rights journalism empowers communities to advocate for change and support non-profit organizations addressing these issues. So I think that we talked about how there is this collaboration between non-government organization and media advocacy. How development journalism, of course, benefits non-government organizations and vice versa. So this is a reciprocal, of course, help and change. These are some general principles of reporting, and they are also advanced and postulated by the United Nations. If you, for example, consult the website of this organization, so you will find that it tackled also these issues, how the report on human rights should look like. So the first thing is accuracy. So this is something accuracy, very accurate, very precise, very focused. It should identify one single issue, responsibility and accountability. So the those journalists, for example, they should be very responsible for anything, for example, that they say, and for everything that they account. Fairness, so this is establishing, of course, justice. So this is also very important because they defend the human rights, they advocate for human rights, so they should begin with themselves in the first instance. So they should be very fair and they should balance, of course, this fairness. What does it mean? It means that maybe sometimes you find a male journalist portraying about women, so he should be very fair while portraying about women. Okay, the same. It's vice versa. It's the same thing. So again, this question of contextualization with data is very important. Objectivity and impartiality. So objectivity is very demanded. It's very needed in reporting on human rights. So those journalists, reporters, for example, so they should be very objective and very neutral. Timeliness and relevance. So any report, for example, on human rights, so it should be very relevant to the space, for example, because it narrates something about a certain space. So we talked about storytelling, how it can be like a sort of storytelling. So it should be very relevant to the particularities of that space, to the particularities of the time. So the setting, it's like the setting of the report should be very, very palpable, and this is something also very, very needed. Well, so as a conclusion, we I just opt to conclude with this image or picture. So you see this photo, that means that human rights should be tackled with scrutiny and with objectivity. In any report, for example, or all reports on human rights, they should take into consideration that question of objectivity, accuracy. They should be very concise, very relevant, and they should take into consideration the context where, of course, and when they get those information, in order, of course, to preserve human dignity, which is the most important thing in human rights premises. Well, so these are the references of our lecture. So you can consult them later on if you would like to get deeper or delve into those details later on. Thank you very much.